Hi, I'm Sara Gross, host of the Women's Performance Podcast.
And I'm Molly Hurford, taking over this feed for a 5-episode series called The Business of Fitness, where we're exploring all things athletic industry related through the lens of women who are kicking ass in their professions.
Hey, Molly.
Hey, Sara. How's it going?
It's going great. I am so excited to be starting this new project with you. Yay.
I know. Oh my gosh. It's just the perfect melding of everything that I'm so excited to talk about all day, every day.
Yeah, for sure. So at least a couple months ago, time's in a weird warp still for me, but you came to me with this idea and it fit in so well with some of the things that we are doing with the Outspoken Summit this year as well, of starting a new podcast. And so here we are announcing the first episode. Tell us about this podcast.
Yes. So we are here with the business of fitness. And my thought for this was there are so many people right now who want to get into the fitness industry, women in particular, who really want to get into whether it's the endurance sport side of things, whether it's starting their own podcast or cooking company, or becoming a dietitian, or any of these things within the fitness space. We have so many amazing ideas, but then there are so many women in particular who are kind of struggling with like, okay, well, what are the first steps, or even what are the second steps? Like, I have the idea, I've maybe started the website. Where do I go from here? How do I get clients? How do I do bookings? How do I make this dream actually a legitimate reality? And so I've been interviewing people in this space for 15 years now. If we go back to when I first, more than 15 years, when I go back to when I first started as a journalist. And, I've kind of been in every different angle of the fitness industry, working with brands, with magazines, writing books on this stuff, teaching yoga, coaching camps, coaching clinics, doing talks.
That really is every side of what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you name it. And I've done it and probably made a bunch of mistakes in the process. Whether we're talking about figuring out if you need an LLC in like the most practical sense, how to deal with tax prep, and hey, what stuff can you deduct, to how do you post a podcast? Like, great, I've recorded these episodes. How do they actually go up on the internet? And how do I traditionally publish? Do I self-publish? How do I get clients to show up to the yoga studio? Why am I alone in the yoga studio at 5 a.m.? Because no one is showing up to my 5 a.m. class, as it turns out. So, this whole idea kind of was born out of making a lot of these mistakes, hearing from other women that they want into the fitness industry, but something is stopping them. And there are so many amazing women doing awesome things in the industry and just absolutely kicking ass. And I was like, what are their secrets? How are they doing this?
Yes.
And yes, you were one of those women. So
I also know a lot of people who, have started, women who have started things and then get stuck somewhere, right? And are looking for like, hey, what's the next step, or how do I, and I can really relate to getting stuck too. So there's the problem solving part of business. Like, how do I grow my social media? Some of the things you were saying, but like not even just off the start line, but even like 2 years in, 3 years in, I think there's a lot of information that we can mine out of like various guests throughout this series.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think what I love about you and I kind of coming together and figuring out how this is going to look is that you really come from it. We joke about from the more motivational, like believe in yourself, dreams can happen side of things. Yeah. And I come from like give me the to-do list app that you use and the exact way that you're doing that. I am so very much about the actionable, how we're going to what app I'm going to use to write this stuff out kind of side. So I think with our powers and visions combined, we have this concept that is now very much like, we're here to motivate you, to get you pumped up to go after these dreams, but also here are the steps that you need to take to make those a reality. Mm-hmm. So I'm super excited. So we're starting just as part of the Women's Performance Podcast, because we see this as when we're looking at performance, this is a holistic whole life thing, right? Like, yeah, I mean, when you started the Performance Podcast, I know, we were kind of thinking, or you were thinking more athletic performance, but it's very quickly blossomed from there. like almost instantly.
And I have to tell you, like the blossoming sort of natural to me. Like even when we started that podcast, I was like, how long do I have to talk about specifically athletic performance before I can start like bringing in other things, you know? So, and I think that like, and those things overlap. So what we learn from sport and in the fitness world and overlaps into how we do business, or overlaps into how confident we feel moving into new spaces, or what all of those things. So I just don't think we can pull those things apart. I think they're all part and parcel of one thing. So I love like, and you know, I know I've said this to you before. I often say this to my team, but like, I think there's so many podcasts out there that are male led, for lack of like, you know, that around this concept of like how we can be better humans, you know, and one week they might have on like a longevity expert, you know, and the next week they have on someone who's talking about a very precise way to balance your testosterone. And then the next week, you know, it's this variety of topics. And so I think there's a bit of a lack of that in women's space. Right. And I'd like to speak into that space, whether that's like across topics that relate to like business, health, wellness, sport, culture, all of the things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when we started, my husband and I have our coaching company and podcast, The Consummate Athlete. And a big part of that is respecting that people have these busy, driven, active lives that they're leading outside of sport. And how can you talk about training without talking about whole life, right? If you're completely slammed at work and you have a big business presentation on Friday, but your goal race is on Saturday, how is that actually going to work out for you? How can you make that work if you have them on separate calendars and you never think about them overlapping? But they do. And, you know, the same thing is true here. Like, as we're talking about this business within the fitness industry, I think we're going to hear from a lot of people who are going to laugh about how much less they've gotten to ride or run or do the thing now that they're doing the thing professionally. But, you know, really, like, we want to excel at our business and, you know, really make the most out of it because we want to have the time, the ability to do all of the other stuff we love as well.
Mm-hmm. I've started doing this thing in the morning. It's just kind of relates, and it was just coming up in my mind. So I'll like, where instead of, because I was getting, you know, sometimes in a to-do list, you can get kind of bogged down, or some mornings, like I know my to-do list's there, but I have this like, I like squirm away from it, kind of, I cringe, I don't want to look. And so I started doing this thing in the morning where I sit down and I go, what does success look like for me today? Right. And then it includes all of the things. Like, it's not just the to-do list. It's like, at work, I would like to accomplish this and this. And I like to spend time with my daughter, and I'd like to be kind to as many people as I can. Right? Like, it can include any of the things I want to work out, and I want to get the best of that part of my day, you know. And then I can kind of, even if I don't write it down, at least I've like got this mental map then that I can work into the day. And I think a lot of people work like that, whether they do it intentionally by sitting down and writing a success list or not. I think that's a real part of how we live.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's very funny because despite the fact that we come at things very tactically differently, we both do the exact same thing in the morning. So
amazing. Perfect. Great minds.
Yep. It's true. Yep. Minds. I write out a few sentences of like what today is going to look like. Mine might have a little less to do with kindness to strangers, to be totally honest. But now that you've said it, I'm like, crap, like, I have to add that.
I better put that on.
Better put that on there. Amazing. And practically speaking, this first set in this series, we're going to run a few episodes on the Women's Performance Podcast. And if you like these, please make sure you let us know over on our Instagrams, leave ratings and reviews, get in touch via email. Just, you know, we'd love to hear from people, like what they want to get out of the series, if they're enjoying it, who they'd want to hear from, if there are any areas of business that they'd want focused on, because we can definitely make that happen as we sort of navigate what this is going to look like.
Totally.
And, you know, obviously we're going to be starting out with some of our, you know, most loved people here at Feisty Media. So this episode, the starting episode, is actually going to be with Sara, all about podcasting, because I mean, how could we not start with that? But we have, you know, quite a few guests lined up to come after that. So definitely let us know, you know, what you think of it.
Yeah, for sure. That's really important because if everyone loves this podcast, so I'm basically handing over this feed to Molly for the next 5 weeks, and I'm yay. I'm sure no one will complain about that. And definitely let us know what you think, because if we love it, we'll carry on while I have a chance to regroup and figure out what we're doing with the rest of the Women's Performance podcast.
Amazing. Okay, well, let's get into this. We're going to take a quick pause here, and then we're going to come back with me as the interviewer and Sara as the interviewee. Okay, so now we're shifting gears. We're going into the interview. I am now officially the interviewer, and you, Sara, are officially the interviewee. So welcome to the Business of Fitness podcast.
Thank you. I just changing my hat.
Yep.
Figuratively.
Yeah. So the first thing I actually wanted to play with you is this game that I want to play with everyone that comes on this podcast. Expectation.
Oh no.
Yeah, I know. I didn't prep you for this.
You did not warn me about a game.
I did not. Yeah. I want to play expectation versus reality. So when you first thought you were planning to start this podcast, what expectation did you have for it? How did you picture your life turning out, or how did you picture the podcast going? And then hit us with what the reality has been.
Wow. Okay. Versus reality. That's so hard. Okay. So first of all, it was like my original seed. I was always like, keep your dreams broad enough, and so that you'll definitely get there, because there's 20,000 different paths you could get there. So I think my dream was around media company, quote unquote, and I was willing to take, or having like a big enough influence to be able to have a voice in a cultural narrative. Like that's basically my goal. So, and I don't think we're there yet, right? So, but 5 years ago versus reality, I think I was stunned by how fast we grew. Like, not to be, but I just said, I knew I was rolling the dice on something that was, I don't know what percentage I would have given it on being successful, and I don't know what I would have called success or failure. Like I didn't itemize any of those things, right? But I just thought, yeah. So I think my expectation was that it might stay, that there was a very good chance that it was going to stay a part-time gig, potentially into forever. And I did not expect to be able to step back from some of the original podcasts that we launched so quickly. And then reality was that, like, for whatever reason, this isn't about me. I managed to attract, like, in the way of the universe, if you will, attract certain people by, talking about what we were doing, and attract certain ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of spun upwards faster than I expected.
I love that. And I think the talking about what you're doing is something I want to come back to, as we're going to talk about your ability to grow communities so quickly, because I think that's something that a lot of people who want to start a podcast don't actually think about when they're kind of initially putting the idea together. And even when they've gotten started with the podcast, I think there's a lot of people who have one, but never actually tell anyone about it necessarily.
Right. Great point.
Yeah. To me, as I was thinking about the whole narrative of starting a podcast, because obviously both of us have been doing this podcasting thing for a few years now. I think when I first thought about starting The Consummate Athlete, my current and original podcast, I kind of my expectation was a little bit more Instagrammy or Pinterest worthy, where I had this beautiful studio and, really nice, like cool audio equipment and blah, blah, blah. And the reality is, more often than not, we're like recording in closets.
Yeah.
So I think mine was a lot 100%. Less aesthetic than I maybe anticipated it being, we'll say.
Yeah, that's funny. I listened to, did you ever listen to the podcast Startup?
Ooh, no. Should I?
It's essentially the guy who started Gimlet, the podcasting company that I think recently sold to Spotify. I could have that wrong. But he basically made a podcast about creating a podcast company. And I listened to this whole thing. And he went out and got the VC funding. I think he had like 2 million in funding to begin with. He had this episode about putting together this beautiful studio. And I remember having a moment like, do I need to do that?
Oh, no.
But then everything I read and everything I saw on social media, even some of the ways social media got shared is I'm like, some of the more raw content that's a little bit less quote unquote pro, does better sometimes, and I just thought we don't really need that. So I haven't really had, I love it. I do have a vision of a studio, because right now, like, you'll hear it if you haven't already, the seagulls and everything still I have a better microphone now, but I don't have any soundproofing, stuff like that. So I do have still a vision of a beautiful studio where we record perfectly sounding podcasts.
It'll always be the dream. But okay, let's recap though. Let's go back. What was the first podcast you started? How did it get going? Just give us sort of the quick rundown of the last, few years in this space, just so people who haven't been with you the whole journey kind of have a quick idea of from there to here.
Yeah. So I started super small. I was actually doing an internship at another media company where I produced a podcast called Iron Women. Right. And then I think at that time, I might have been doing it by myself, or I might have had Alyssa Godesky, who's still the host on that show, one of the hosts co-hosting with me. So when I left that internship, they let me take the show with me. And so I sort of thought at the time, if I can get one podcast off the ground, get a couple sponsors on it, then that's where I'm going to start. Like, I'm not going to worry about how we're all going to make a living, just yet. I'm just going to make one work. Mm-hmm. So I basically kind of used some of the relationships I had with industry folks and kind of made that podcast. And when I say work, I think the first time around I charged $100 a month for podcast advertising. Mm-hmm. That was the size of our audience, so I made that one work. And then I hired, quote unquote, which with that $100, I hired another host for that podcast. Actually, I think she volunteered for a little while before we started to pay her as well. And then I started the second podcast pretty quickly after that with Kelly O'Mara that still runs, that I do now with Sarah True, called If We Were Riding. And I had those two podcasts and a newsletter that Kelly wrote out of the goodness of her heart for at least a year,
Oh man, what happens if you get laryngitis? Does everything just completely cease to be?
Everything shuts down. Yeah. Luckily that never happened. But yeah, when you think about it like that, you think at every stage of business, right? You think you have to sort of think, what would happen if this person's out? And we've had to deal with it a lot this summer with people on holidays at different times. And then you really realize the value of the various people on your team. But yeah, I guess if I'd got laryngitis, I don't know, we would have been replaying an episode. Right? That's for sure.
So with Iron Women and if we were riding, what kind of questions were you asking yourself to get these going? Were you thinking about what are people looking for? Where are the gaps in the podcast market? Like, what questions did you ask yourself as you kind of came up with these ideas?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think I was less looking at the podcast market overall, although lots of people used to tell me lots of stats and stuff, but I was more looking at the specific niche I was working in, right? So I knew from being a triathlete myself, the ways in which women were underserved in the triathlon market. So I think that was specifically what I was leaning into, rather than even now I don't really, but I didn't really have any knowledge of podcasting. I didn't do a course about podcasting. I didn't know about podcast market. I didn't know any of those things broadly. I just talked to a specific community that was my community and my people. So in Iron Women, we interview the pro women, a lot of the pro women or influential women in triathlon. And on If We Were Riding, it was just essentially just Kelly and I shooting the shit about, it's like two friends talking as if they're on bikes, right? Which is something, again, like we don't, and the people who listen to that podcast still, like, they just wanted something to go running. They want someone to go running with them. It's like they're running with their friends or they're biking with their friends in their ears.
I love that.
Yeah. And so I kind of had a sense of that. So and then if I'm going to take anything tangible or that I learned out of that, like, I think we accidentally did the right thing by being so niche and being willing to be niche about what we were doing and not shooting for the stars in the first instance, like I'm going to change the world with one podcast. It's like, I'm going to just talk to my people,
Well, I think that's a huge thing, is like talking to your people, not trying to talk to like who you think your people should be, or who you think the bigger audience is, or who you think your people, you want your people to be. It's like, no, who are your people right now? Like, where are they? And I think podcasting actually, like, I don't know if it was planned or not, but is sort of the perfect avenue for these very busy, very accomplished women, because as you just said, like, we're just going on a run. Like, they're coming, you're coming along for the run, because that's for me, like, that's when I have time to listen to or like input new information. I never sit and watch videos, to be honest. I need to be listening to the stuff on the run. That's how I get my information. So I think you kind of you met people where they are as you came up with the channel, or the way you were doing it, the podcast, and then who you were talking to worked very well.
That's exactly, and I think sometimes we're afraid to start too small, because it might not be as monetizable or something like that, but actually reaching a big audience, or an audience that's in the distance from you, is really difficult. And so that was, and also the other thing I definitely remember asking myself, and I think is worth asking, is like, where's my point of leverage, right? Like, if I just stuck a thing on my Instagram right now that says I'm starting a podcast, who would listen, right? And like, talk to those 5 people, right? Or whoever they are. Like, don't be worried about the size of the audience, but like, who do you have right now that you could talk to, who would go, oh, that was a really cool episode, and share it with their friends?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that kind of leads into even just like the monetizing and going after sponsors and advertisers, right? Because if you're trying to kind of reach this really large audience, then who is going to sponsor you? Like, who are the people you want to bring in? But if you have this niche that has this specific set of needs, like, that's actually a much more valuable proposition for a sponsor, for an advertiser, than I talk to people. No, I talk to busy women triathletes. Like, that is a very specific group. That is a group that, we understand what they need, and, how to talk to them and how to market to them.
Yes, exactly. And you need to, as the host of the show, like, you need to understand how to sell to those people too. And the product has to line up with that. Right. So it all has to line up together. You can't just throw, I mean, you can throw eggs at the wall if you want, but.
Exactly. Yeah. So with all of the podcasts, when have you started monetizing? Was that always sort of going on in your head as you thought about starting the show, or was that kind of a quick thing you got into, or was it a slow ramp up?
Yeah. So I want to say it's luck, but it's not. Anyone could do this. I think I got a business mentor through a women's entrepreneurship program here in Canada. And she was amazing. She ran a bicycling magazine in Vancouver. And one of the things she said to me in one of our first calls, like, we were talking about, just trying to figure out the sponsorship thing. And she said she had put brands on some of on her, she did mostly web stuff. So she had made ads for brands for free. Sometimes if she was going off after another company. So let's say, like, you want to, you would serve, or she would say, I would do a really low priced, if I had to put a low price point on an advertising package, so that you can let everybody know what you're capable of in terms of advertising, and that will bring in other companies.
Oh, that is so smart.
Yeah. I actually never got to the point of free. I think I did a couple times. I did ads in exchange for goods or an affiliate kind of program, which never makes a ton of money, but unless you have a huge audience, but for that same reason, to be able to show other brands what you can do. So we would do, but from the beginning, like I said, I did some contracts that were $50 a podcast. It's barely worth your time to write the contract. It's just like, but you're learning and you're practicing something, and you're learning how to work with companies, and I'm so glad that I did that. Like, just go through the process, even though it feels at the time it's a bit soul sucking because you're like doing all this work and you're like, I just made $200. Great.
Yeah. The when you're chasing the like $75 invoice, it definitely hurts a little bit for sure.
Yeah.
But I think that's exactly it, because then you can go to the next brand and say, I've had, XYZ brands on this show and it's gone well, they're happy. It's sort of a win-win, really. Like it.
And yeah, and the other thing you get is some ROI numbers too, right? So you're like, okay, with this brand, we reached this number of people and they sold. Sometimes if the brand gives you a code, you have numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have a direct return that you can show. And that's that's super valuable when you're talking to the next brand.
Mm-hmm. Any tips on doing those like ad reads and stuff like that? Because I know it seems like such an easy thing until you sit down to actually do the darn thing. And then you're staring into the microphone, into the abyss for, hours trying to figure out how to phrase things or say things or sound casual. You start like questioning the sound of your own voice. So how do you do it?
Totally. Yeah, I have found we still struggle with this because we have found it's so different. The expectations are so different for different companies, and now that we're charging a bit more and a little bit more professional, like there's an expectation there too. And so it's I've had everything from, doing an ad where, my co-host and I are just riffing and she ends up saying, this is one of the most effective ads too. She ends up saying that the goggles that were sponsoring us should have a loon detection feature because she was scared of loons when she swam in the open water. But we've never heard back from so many people on that ad. So they would they start to associate like, and that's how we talked in the podcast, just like weird stuff all the time. And it totally worked. Whereas there are other brands who will give you an exact ad read. And we'll say, I've heard back from brands who are like, she said this one word instead of this word. Can you change it? So we always have that conversation first. Like, what is the expectation of the company first? And then, and then I actually find it pretty easy to read off of a paper. Mm-hmm. So once I know that, I'm like, okay, this company's fine. If I did 3 ads yesterday. The first one, I just talked off the top of my head, right? About the relationship I have with the company, right? The second one, I kind of talked off some talking points. And the third one, I had everything written out. And that was because we knew what those brands wanted. So
I like it. Yeah. Just making sure you know the exact parameters of what they want from you is just so, so helpful. But yeah, it's funny. I find the conversational ones that are woven in, like those are the ones mm-hmm. that I feel like do the best in terms of what people remember and what catches your attention. So personally, I don't understand why brands go any other way at this point, but
yeah, like some brands don't want a goofy conversation about a loon detection feature, but I think that's, if I was the marketing person there, I think that's the wrong choice personally.
I mean, I'm going to be thinking about that for the next day. So they get like a freebie right here.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing I'll say too about monetizing, just before we move on, is like, if you are someone who's doing a podcast because you run a coaching company, I mean, you'll have experience with this too. Or if you have some kind of services that you're selling, like writing, we put our own ads in as well. So like we have the Outspoken Summit coming up. So we have an ad coming out now that's going to go on all the podcasts for the Outspoken Summit. And so that stuff, that's easier too, right? Because like, your own stuff, you're the brand you're working with, right? And then it just makes sure that you're reminding your audience every single week what the other things are that you're doing too.
Definitely.
For decades, running shoes have been researched, tested, and designed for men. Brands have relied on the shrink it and pink it approach to sell male shoes to female customers. That's why we are so excited to be working with Hedas. Hedas designs athletic footwear for women that elevates performance, safety, and style. Hedas unlocks the science behind women's biomechanics through dedicated research, creates better shoes for women that support their longevity and performance, and establishes new design standards to promote transparency in a male-biased industry. Hedas have a lower ankle collar to reduce rubbing, a breathable mesh toe box to allow for ventilation and to allow for female toe shape, a special kind of plate in the midsole to keep tired legs going, a narrow heel cup to reduce heel slippage and take the pressure off our Achilles, and a rounded instep to create a snug fit. Hedes has 3 shoe models designed for different sessions: the Alma Cruise for long runs, the Alma Tempo for training days, and the Alma Speed for pushing the pace. I've personally been running in the Alma Cruise and I love them. It's the shoe I always wanted and never knew I needed. The fit is perfect in every way. You can get your own pair of Hedes at hedes.com and use the code Feisty20 for 20% off. That's Feisty20 at hedes.com, and it will all be in the show notes. Endurance sports should be accessible to everyone, right? That's why we are so excited to be partnering with Motive. Motive is one of the fastest growing training apps in the world today, with thousands of amateur athletes signing up every month and a nearly perfect 4.9 star rating in the App Store. You are not a template, and your training plan should not be either. Prepare for running races, triathlons, cycling events, duathlons, or swim runs, however your season schedule shapes up, and get training written by some of the best coaches in the world in each discipline who know what it takes to help amateur athletes reach their goal on race day. The app takes the training written by those experts and then creates the most optimal training plan for your schedule, abilities, and goals. Plus, the training is fully customized to your race schedule, how much you can train each week, your current abilities, and the goals you want to achieve in your race. You can use the app for free as long as you want, or get all the upgraded features from the app for just $19.99 a month. But as a Feisty listener, you can sign up at mymotive.com and use the code Feisty for 2 months of full premium access. That's right, you get 2 months of premium for free. So you quite literally have nothing to lose. So head over to mymotive.com, mymotiv.com, and use the code Feisty, Feisty. And on a personal note, I know the founder of Motive, and he is driven to make triathlon and all endurance sports more accessible for the athletes who care about their performance, but who aren't quite ready for a full-time personal coach. If that sounds like you, definitely try the app for 2 months for free. You literally have nothing to lose. As we head into summer, rest and recovery are critical for improving sports performance, reducing stress, and living a long and healthy life. We should all invest in better sleep. So, think about the thing you lay your head on for 8 hours a night. If it's not exactly right for you, it can lead to needless tossing and turning, or worse, have you waking up with an unrelenting kink in your neck. My new Lagoon pillow has helped me improve my sleep immensely by pairing me with the performance pillow that has everything I need. So I personally was matched with the Otter pillow. Shout out to Team Otter, which I love because it has a gentle cooling effect. And I was able to choose how much stuffing I wanted in it, which is super important to me because I'm doing a decent amount of CrossFit these days and my shoulders are kind of creaky. So having a pillow that is stuffed just to the right height keeps my neck and head in exactly the right position and comfortable for the entire night. And as of fall 2023, Lagoon launched their 100% mulberry silk pillowcases. It's cool to the touch, buttery soft, and great for your skin and hair. You've got to go check out this pillowcase if you want to feel great and look great every morning. Waking up for morning workouts has never felt better. I'm refreshed and pain-free thanks to my Lagoon pillow. To check it out for yourself, go to lagoonsleep.com/performance and take the 2-minute sleep quiz to find your perfect pillow match. and then use the code PERFORMANCE for 15% off your first purchase. That's code PERFORMANCE at lagoonsleep.com/performance, whole 15% off, and the link is in the show notes. You can just click through there.
Speaking of the Outspoken Women's Conference, well, speaking of that, honestly, I mean, that is the reason we even thought about starting this podcast. That's a big part of what got us both excited about this topic, is this idea of bringing women together to get to talk about these more business sides of the fitness industry that, we all have found ourselves in here. So give us a little plug. Tell us a little bit about the summit while we're here.
Okay, so this year, we've had in 2018 and 2019, we had the Outspoken Women in Triathlon Summit, and that was all about women's leadership in triathlon and kind of moving the dial to get more women at all different levels in triathlon, like from race directors to federation leadership, industry leadership, people running their own businesses, coaching, etc. And so this year we're expanding it into endurance sport more broadly, and we're actually talking to the business side more specifically. Right. So we have at the conference is going to be amazing. We have a lot of practical skills around how you can actually build your business, like from social media to a topic like this, like how you actually create the podcast in terms of a podcast, in terms of how you like using GarageBand, like the actual nuts and bolts or whatever you're going to use for your editing tool, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of practical advice for business building, as well as the leadership focus that we've had in past years, which is like, that's the kind of stuff I love. Like I like a broad thinker. So I love hearing from different people about, in the past we've had Yvonne Spencer talking about being the first, like she was the first African-American woman in certain Army positions, and she was the first 12 different times in her career. And she talked about that. So I'm excited to have everyone back in person, first of all, and to have that bigger community of women who want to continue to who want to be leaders themselves and who are leaders and who also want to continue to build women's leadership in endurance sport.
I love that. And I really do appreciate the two sides of it, this more esoteric, more motivational side, but then the very nitty gritty side. And since you mentioned GarageBand, now I know, I know that you no longer do the editing for the podcast, but I also know that you did the editing at first. So for someone who wants to start a podcast, I know they can hop on Fiverr or any one of these things and just send away the audio files and get the podcast put together, put out, all of that if they want to. Do you think there is value though in learning some of the editing, all of like the uploading, figuring out the podcast host, all of that jazz?
I do. I think there's a lot of value in that. Like, I love the fact that now in my business, I know how to do everything, even though everyone who's doing those jobs do it 10 times better than I ever did. But it's important to have, from where I am now, it's really important for me to have some kind of understanding of what has to happen. So I'm really glad that I didn't even consider getting someone else to edit it. And also I love editing. It's creative, and I want the podcast to sound how I want it to sound. I don't really want to send it away to someone who doesn't understand the content, who I just grabbed off of Fiverr. I don't know. Do you edit your own podcast?
I do actually. Yeah, we still do. And honestly, I don't know that I would have it any other way at this point. And maybe it's partially because I'm a little bit of a control freak, but there are just kind of these little small things where it's, if we have a pro on and she or he mentions the wrong brand by accident because they just got a new sponsor and switched brands, like I can go in and make that edit. Probably better than if I had to try to tell someone like, I think around minute 10, they said, Garmin when they meant Lesign or something like that. So I find that easier and a little less stressful because then I'm not worried and I don't have to recheck the edits. So maybe that's where the control freakness comes in. Also, to be honest, you know what? I listen to a lot of podcasts and even some of the bigger ones where I know they have an editor. Sometimes the editors actually mess up pretty badly and it's like no one catches it. So maybe that's like partially my neuroticism is just very nervous about that happening. But I'm also lucky that my husband handles all of the uploading side of things. So I don't have to do all of that. I just have to edit the files. So we do have it split into categories here.
Yeah, even then we have, we just moved onto a platform where there's dynamic ads, which means that the ads update back through all the episodes. So do you know what I mean? So if we're currently, whoever our current sponsor is gets all the episodes from the beginning, their ads.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's pretty good. Because then they get more, that sponsor gets more bang for the buck, basically. And you don't have old ads just stuck with old discount codes and stuff like that into episodes. Anyway, and what was I going to say? Oh yeah. And then there's like some glitches happen. Like, so we had a glitch happen. I got these messages that were like, hey, at minute 11 of this podcast, there's a big blank spot, right? And it's like, oh, oops a daisy, the dynamic ad isn't playing over there. So we had to go in and fix. So it's stuff still happens.
Oh, I think stuff happens no matter what. There was one, this is like a really embarrassing one. I was like recording at my in-laws. And at one point my mother-in-law came in and like had a conversation with me. And I completely forgot to edit it out. And someone was like, love that chat with your mother-in-law. And I was like, oh no.
Yeah, that's so good.
So it happens.
It's real life.
Real life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So in your years of doing this, on the note of making mistakes, have you made any or had to pivot anything or done anything that looking back, you're like, oh, I would have done that differently?
Right. Okay. I made a few notes about this because it's like pivots and mistakes are kind of different, or maybe they're the same. I don't know. I think the biggest mistake I think that I've made, and this is not just about podcasting, right? But is about as a leader, sometimes I'm not clear enough when I'm saying something that might be perceived as negative. Does that make sense?
So meaning like you soften things too much because you're afraid of going too negative, or the opposite? It's like this. I'm not afraid of going negative, and I genuinely see things in a positive sense. So I tend to it's like a genuine thing. I tend to give feedback in a way that's like, okay, I think what we could learn here is this and this and this, right? And I've realized for some people's communication style, they take away from every conversation that everything is wonderful, they're great, and carry on, right? When I've thought that I communicated, okay, we could learn to do this better. Right. And that's like genuinely how I communicate. And I have had to learn that some people don't hear that unless they're being told more directly. No, stop doing that way. do it this way, which I don't have to communicate very often, but every once in a while I'm like, oh, I didn't draw the line in this line in the sand wasn't kind of grooved in deep enough. And so that's kind of something that's sprinkled through. That's not specifically to do with podcasting, but just when I was trying to think through like mistakes, and I was like, oh, that's it. The thing I will say with podcasting specifically, one thing I will say is that one of the best things we did was pivot when we pivoted and went outside of triathlon, and we talked at the beginning about being niche. So like I learned all these lessons in triathlon. When I say in triathlon, I mean in building a triathlon brand. So we built a triathlon brand called Feisty Triathlon. We have 3 podcasts that run sort of through that brand. And we have sponsors of that brand, but I have not managed to figure out a good digital product or something. We haven't really been able to figure out what that community really needs, so that brand is it covers its costs. It's like, it's fine, right? But it's not, in terms of having a growing business, it's not necessarily a place of growth for us. Mm-hmm. So actually seeing the opportunities outside of triathlon and jumping into them was scary, but really good. And also keeping that, because our super fans, like the people who've been with Feisty and followed our journey from the beginning, a lot of them come from triathlon. Mm-hmm. And so continuing to create value for that community is important, even though sometimes it's like, it's still kind of difficult from a business perspective. Yeah. Right. And I understand, I'm in there every day. Like, I understand why it's been harder to build a women's community in triathlon than it has been, say, in gravel cycling, because in triathlon, there's 100 different women's communities and there's lots of things to choose from, et cetera, et cetera.
But yeah, so in terms of like a pivot, like actually taking that jump and going, okay, we're gonna pull ourselves away from everything that I know and do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I think you kept like a pretty strong through line. So even though, yes, we're going outside of that women's triathlon niche, we still kind of kept it like you kept it in women's endurance sport. So it's not so much that you like completely 180 to men's mahjong or something. You kept it very much still in your wheelhouse, as it were.
Totally. One of the first things we did was outside triathlon was the menopause brand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also why it was a little bit scary, because it's like, okay, we're going to talk about menopause just boldly and out there and all the things. And we're going to kind of rebrand it and make it, and make it bring like positive connotation to menopause.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like we do have within that community, there are quite a few people who wouldn't necessarily identify as endurance athletes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been part of like the branching out, but still quite a lot of cyclists, and it's a both end.
Yeah. Yeah. Fitness adjacent, people will say. People who are at least like sort of interested in that sphere.
Yes.
And I mean, I think all of that kind of comes down to this idea of community. And I mean, that's where part of your nerves would have come from with shifting away from triathlon, because that's the community that you created. Community has been a huge part. I mean, I would even venture to say it's a big part of why you started all of this in the first place. That's kind of how this all started. And I think podcasts often can be done in this sort of vacuum where, like I said at the beginning of this, you are doing the podcast in your closet, you're putting it out, you're not sharing it. It's just kind of, oh yes, I have a podcast. No one listens to it. It's over here. And then you're confused why you're not in the top of the charts. Weird, right? But you've done an amazing job. I mean, bringing these conferences to real life and virtually in the past couple of years. You're doing a ton on social media. I think when I had you on my podcast a few months ago, I asked how the heck you had time or like energy to deal with TikTok. So there was that. Like, you're doing all these reels and I don't understand how you have the creativity to do that when you're doing so many other things. So, I mean, how have you leveraged all of these other platforms to bring awareness to the podcast? And I mean, is that a big part of why the podcasts are thriving, do you think?
I do. So I think a couple of things are coming to mind there. I'm just kind of jotting them down so I don't forget them. But like one thing, because people ask me this a lot, with every new podcast, you have to create a feedback loop with your audience, right? And preferably more than one feedback loop. So that might be like an associated Facebook group. That's a private group where you drop the podcast in when it comes out every week. People can talk about the podcast there. What we do on some of them. So for example, Iron Women has a mailbag. So you write an email to an email address, you get your questions answered. These are typical things that podcasts do, but you've then created a conversation with your people. On If We Were Riding, we do voice memos. So anyone can send us a voice note and we play like almost 100% of them. Every once in a while, it's just me screwing up that something slips through the cracks, but more or less we'll unedited play people's, because they're just adding to the conversation. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's like at least one or two of those things. And then social media would be in that category too. Like creating a place where people can comment and talk about, and where you can take the feedback to where it's like, okay, I think people want to hear about this topic or that topic. So that's one thing that sounds really simple, but actually it's quite a bit of extra work. And then another thing I heard at a social media conference really early, which I'm glad that I did, was that someone just got on stage and said, however long it takes you to create a piece of content, you should spend that long pushing that content out.
Ooh, right? I love that.
Mm-hmm. So that's like, and so few people do that. Right. And now I can see with the team, then now how everything's, I'm like, oh yeah, we do that now. But at the time it was like mind blown. If I spend, by the time I've recorded, edited, if I spend 4 or 5 hours creating this podcast, like, what do I even do for 4 or 5 hours pushing it out on social? That's a lot of pushing out a podcast, right? But then once you get going with it and you're talking to people, you're sharing it in various different places, you're responding to all the comments, once you get going, it can be time consuming.
Yeah. Well, and my natural kind of pushback on that was like, oh my gosh, I already barely have time as it is. How am I supposed to make time for that? But it kind of comes back to, if you want it to succeed, if you want it to work, like that's part of the game now. Again, you can't just put it out and expect that people are going to magically find it somehow. Like that doesn't happen. No one will find it.
Exactly. The other thing I find people, or the way people tend to think that I think is, that I don't think necessarily holds, is like that they're going to have big name guests on the podcast, and then that is somehow going to bring in people. I don't know. Yeah, you're shaking your head. Like that has not been my experience, unless the guest is massive, right? Which how often? I mean, I don't have people that are massive. I don't have like the Oprah Winfrey's of the world on my podcast very often, right? So like, and people who have say 100,000 followers on Instagram or whatever, they typically don't share it.
Yep. That's the thing. There's like a sweet spot of, I think I've said before, it's like 10 to 25,000 followers, where the people will still share the podcasts that they're on and be really excited about it, or at least pretend to be really excited about it. We'll take it. And then usually bigger than that, they don't actually reshare that often. So I think that, you want to hit that sweet spot as far as like looking for guests, people that will actually share it. Although, I mean, maybe that's a good topic that we can kind of touch on right now is, when you have a guest on, how are you kind of ensuring that they are sharing the podcast and getting it out there?
Yeah, we don't, we've played around with this a lot. Like I've not found one strategy that works for everyone. So, sometimes we send an email. We have one podcast where the guest always gets an email afterwards with all the shareable links and everything. Hardly anybody ever shares. I think if you tag someone on social, it's more likely to then show up on their Instagram story or something like that. We started sometimes using the collab feature on Instagram with our video clips that we do, but still some people are like, they either like don't collab it, right? Like because they don't want to, or they don't know how to work the buttons, or someone else is doing the social and there's this disconnect between, the message doesn't get down the line. They're like, yes, share this. And then every once in a while you get a really nice surprise where you're, where the person does share it. So I just think having guests share shouldn't be the central strategy for growing a podcast.
No, absolutely not. And especially because most of the time, pretty rarely do you have people that then come and stay. A lot of the time they come for that guest's podcast and that's it. Like maybe you catch a percentage of them, but they're there to hear the guest, not to hear the podcast. So you're not going to capture everybody there. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So that's so many things that you have to do for like one podcast, and you have a network of them. Practically speaking, how are you keeping all of this on track? Like, what are you using to kind of stay organized to have that time to sit on social and do the time spent actually putting out the podcast, making sure people hear about it, all of that? What are you using?
Yes, great question. So I'm not someone who uses tools a lot, right? So back in the day when I think I was fueled by passion alone, like where I would sit for like 12 or 14 hours a day and just make sure that the podcast was out, that every comment was answered, that, like that fire of just wanting to get all that shit done, I think speaks to a lot, right? So I think at that time I used Calendly to book guests. We recorded on Skype back in the day. But otherwise I didn't have a ton of tools. Now, one of the first, you should hire to your weaknesses. So, one of the first, I think maybe the third full-time person I hired was, is someone just to organize all the things, right? So now we use Google for Business. And now we have all these organizational tools. We still have a lot of things in Google Docs and in Google spreadsheets. Like how we organize our social media and stuff. But I had to hire someone else to do that because that was not good. If it couldn't stay in my brain, it was going to be too much for me. So I don't have any real secret. So my only secret is that like, if you're passionate about it and you love it, you'll just keep going. And seeing like 10 o'clock at night, responding to emails about your podcast doesn't seem arduous. Right?
I love it. I will say Calendly is one of the most useful booking tools that I have found. And the nice thing with them now is they will actually make a Zoom link right within the Calendly. And Zoom now records on both audio channels, which is fantastic. So it makes editing so much easier. So for new podcasters, like that's probably your easiest strategy is, using Calendly to book, use Zoom to record, and there you go. You've got some easy files, no problem. Paying for both of the like premium subscriptions on them, I think is well worth it, but both free versions totally work as well. So that's I think my top easy recommendation when it comes to like stuff to organize your podcast live.
I totally agree with that. We had tried a bunch of things too. Like we had one podcast on Zencaster and then in different places, and we pulled everything back to Zoom, especially when we've started doing video clips, multiple video clips for reels from every podcast. And then you have that right on Zoom too. Mm-hmm. So easy.
Yeah, exactly. I think whenever you can maybe bring all of your tools down because, when you have Zencaster for over here, but Zoom is where most meetings are happening. And then some stuff's happening over here. It just gets so confusing with where everything is. So the simpler you can keep your list of what you're using, I think the better you are, whether we're talking about podcasts or any other kind of business type thing, the simpler is definitely better. Awesome. Okay. Well, before we wrap up, I would say, where can everyone find you? But they can find you here. So that kind of, that sort of simplifies things even further, but let everyone know where they can follow you on all things social to maybe see how it's done.
To see how it's done. Well, okay. I'm Sara at Sara.Gross on Instagram, but follow at Feisty_media on Instagram. That's our main Instagram page. Everything else flows out from there. We also have at Feisty Media on TikTok. And we started posting some stuff on LinkedIn too. So if anyone loves LinkedIn, go over there and find us too. Trying to because we're talking to the business world more. So
I like it, from TikTok to LinkedIn.
Yeah, you can exactly.
Amazing.
Sometimes the same content.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sara. And I'm so excited that we get to do this Business of Fitness series. This has been super fun, and I'm really excited for what's next. Thanks so much for joining me for this first episode of the Business of Fitness podcast here on the Feisty Media Network. I'm so excited to have had Sara Gross on for our first episode. And before we head out for the day, I just wanted to maybe mention a couple of the main conclusions I got from chatting with Sara. The first thing is really just that leaning into your niche is so important. So instead of trying to please everybody or reach out to everyone, think about who it is exactly that you want to reach. Think about the conversations that you want to be having. Really think about what's going to make you feel like you're enjoying the whole thing. And, the more you enjoy it, the more you're kind of creating something that's for you and for people just like you. I think that the more success you're going to have. And, that's what Sara's found. And eventually you can broaden it out, of course, and lean into other interests. But starting with that smaller niche is definitely the way to go. And the second thing, and I think really important, is whatever project you're starting, whether we're talking about podcasting or writing a book or all this stuff, it's so easy to get caught up in what software is going to be the best, or, what website you need to use for this, or, all that kind of stuff. But really what Sara was saying is the simplest thing tends to be what you're already using. Right? So instead of using this fancy podcast device, we're using Zoom to record. Instead of having this huge expensive studio setup, you can just start in your closet or your bathroom or, your bedroom. It doesn't have to be super fancy to be a really excellent product. So don't think about all of the stuff you need or needing to wait to find just the right software. Just kind of get into it with the stuff you already have, and you can always add stuff later. So hopefully this episode was helpful. And again, if you love this episode, definitely let us know over on social media, over in whatever podcast app you're listening to. Leave us some ratings, reviews, and hopefully we can keep this running. And tune back next week for how to write a book. All right, we'll see you soon.
As a lifelong runner and triathlete turned CrossFitter, I am stoked to announce that the athletic eyewear brand Tifosi Optics has joined us as a partner here at Feisty Media. Tifosi sports glasses hit all the marks for athletes. They're shatterproof polybicarbonate, so the lenses not only reduce glare, but also offer scratch resistance, which I 100% need. They stay in place when you are moving. The hydrophilic rubber nose pads actually get more grippy the more you sweat, so they are secure and don't slide down your face even when you're running in hot conditions. No matter what sport you do, Tifosi has shades for you. Whether you love tennis, fishing, pickleball, running, cycling, or just hanging out on the beach. They are super reasonably priced, which I love, so I can have multiple pairs that go with any outfit. And of course, Feisty listeners get a special discount. So head on over to tifosioptics.com and use the code FM20. FM as in Feisty Media to get 20% off your order. That's FM20 at tifosioptics.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. Building muscle can be tough, and gains can be so slow, even for those of us who do a lot of strength training. As an ex-endurance athlete who is now in perimenopause, I know this all too well. It can be frustrating to put in the time in the gym and not see the results I'm looking for. That's why it's super important to take the right supplements at the right time. One of those supplements is essential amino acids, which are needed to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis happens when you eat high-quality protein, like eggs or whey. And by supplementing with additional essential amino acids, you can make sure you are getting the full benefit of your training sessions. Targeted essential amino acid formulas can be up to 4 times more effective than just eating protein. I've been taking amino acids for almost a year, and in combination with eating quality protein and a couple other supplements, I have managed to turn the tides on age-related muscle loss, which starts at 30 for women, by the way, and I have continued to make strength gains as I head towards 50. AminoCo has been a long-time sponsor of Feisty Media and has supported all of our brands and podcasts over the years. I recommend starting with AminoCo Perform, and you can grab some at aminoco.com/performance. If you enter the code PERFORMANCE, you will save 30% and receive a free gift if it is your first purchase. Give it a try and let me know how it goes. That's aminoco.com/performance and use the code PERFORMANCE to save 30%.